Thank you, Margaret. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Chicago Tribune's Printers Row Lit Fest. I have the privilege of speaking today with Paul Taylor, who wrote this book, The Next America, Boomers, Millennials, and the Looming Generational Showdown. So it's a very stat-heavy book, which I would expect nothing less coming from a former reporter, but it's fascinating, and it talks a lot about who we are, who we're becoming, and how that will shape who we are in the future. So welcome, Paul.
Great to be here.
Thank you. So I always think that these programs are better when the audience participates. So I will, as was mentioned, leave some time for questions. So think about those questions and save them in your brain and step up to the microphone when the time comes. I'd appreciate that. I think it'll make it a much better conversation. Paul, your book really lays out a very compelling case about the strengths and the challenges and the gaps that exist between the generations, and you say that they are really poles apart when it comes to certain things, including things like, of course, technology, demographics, politics. I hope that we're going to touch on all those things today, but your book focuses mostly on the living generations, the silent generation, the baby boomers, the Generation X, and the millennials. And you have a really nice couple of capsules on page 33 of the book that talk briefly about each generation. I was wondering if you would read that for the audience to kind of orient everybody to who we're going to be talking about.
Happy to do so. So these are our four adult generations, and I'll start with the youngest, the millennials born after 1980. So the oldest of them is now in his or her early 30s. And here's what the capsule summary. Empowered by digital technology, coddled by parents, respectful of elders, slow to adulthood, conflict averse, at ease with racial, ethnic, and sexual diversity, confident in their economic future despite coming of age in bad times. And then in a very unscientific way, I list some icons for this and other generation. Icons of this generation: Mark Zuckerberg, Lena Dunham, LeBron James, Carrie Underwood, Jennifer Lawrence, Lady Gaga. Next up are Gen Xers, and I've discovered that my host here is a Gen Xer, born from 1965 to 1980, so they're sort of in the middle innings of life, if you will. Savvy entrepreneurial loners, distrustful of institutions, especially government, children of the Reagan Revolution and the divorce revolution, more comfortable than their elders with an increasingly diverse America. Icons: Quentin Tarantino, Will Smith, Adam Sandler, Tiger Woods, Robert Downey Jr. Next up, baby boomers. I'm one of them, born from 1946 to 1964, as exuberant youths led the countercultural upheavals of the 1960s. But the iconic image of that era, long-haired hippie protesters, describes only a portion of the cohort. Now on the front stoop of old age, boomers are gloomy about their lives, worried about retirement, and wondering why they aren't young anymore. Icons: Bill and Hillary Clinton, George W. Bush, Barack Obama, Steve Jobs, Tom Hanks. And finally, our oldest generation, the silent generation, born from 1928 to 1945, so they're now in their late 60s through their 80s. Conservative and conformist, silents are uneasy with the pace of demographic, cultural, and technological change, and with the growing size of government, but hands off Social Security and Medicare. Icons: Clint Eastwood, Neil Armstrong, Marilyn Monroe, Tom Brokaw, Hugh Hefner. There you go. That's who everybody is.
I think we have a few boomers in the audience, Paul. I heard some laughs. Well, I'm a Gen X, as you mentioned, and so I tend to view things through the perspective of a Gen X. And so one thing that struck me is, even though you said those icons were not scientific, there were no women among the Gen X icons. And so I was talking with a friend about that, and we were trying to think of some. And I mean, there are a lot of successful Gen X women, but to get to icon status, it was hard for us. And I wondered what that said about our generation and gender. Sheryl Sandberg was the best that we could come up with, or Molly Ringwald.
It's a great question, and one of the dramatic changes that's happened in the years I track, and more or less this book uses a lot of demographic, economic, and social and attitudinal data, and it kind of starts in the middle of the last century and where possible projects forward to the middle of this century. Gender is one of the great stories of this era. And it's true in this country, it's true around the world. One of the ways I've said it is that gender roles are converging, both at work and at home, and we have a lot of data on that, and you folks, people of all ages, live it. So there are gender changes at work that we know about. The pay gap is shrinking. It hasn't completely disappeared, but at the work level, when we ask young adults, when we ask millennials, how important are the following things in your life? And one of them is being successful in a high-paying career. More young women today than young men say that this is a very important aspiration. This is a complete reversal. We live in an era today where nearly 6 in 10 college students are women. Again, a complete reversal. And we see concomitant reversals in home lives. Today, of all children being raised today, 40% of all children are raised in a household where the woman, the mother, is either the sole or the primary breadwinner. A lot of that is single parents, but an increasing share of that is married parents, and the wife out-earns the husband. These are big changes. Our norms have not completely shifted with this. By and large, most Americans say, if you ask them, what do you think is the best sort of marriage? The traditional marriage, the Ozzie and Harriet marriage, if you will, for somebody my age, you know, a male breadwinner, female homemaker, or a more egalitarian marriage where both the husband and the wife earn money and they share the responsibility for raising the kids. 70–80% of Americans say more egalitarian marriage. So in that sense, the norms have shifted. But then if you go a little bit underneath that and you say to today's public, well, how important is it for a child to have a mother at home? At about 50 or 60% say very important. How important is it for a child to have a father at home? 8 or 10% say very important. So behaviors have changed, norms have changed, but some of the traditional expectations still reflect an older era. So now let me circle back to your question. But believe me, those icons are not scientific, and we could bandy them all about. But I will say, as somebody who looks at these cultural trends and norms, it's a lot easier to find young women who have made their mark in their 20s vis-a-vis young men than older women. This is just the way most societies have been oriented for most of human history. It tends to be the men who rise to the top. I'm not telling anybody anything people know, who become famous, who become the celebrities, who become the leaders of various realms of society. But that is clearly changing.
We talked a little bit earlier about how Gen X has the middle child syndrome. We're stubbornly self-sufficient. We're the DIY generation stuck in between these two giant influential generations. Talk a little bit more. Why is that? Why are we so self-sufficient?
Well, I think the self-sufficiency has to do with it probably starts with the parenting norms. And there was a phrase you don't hear as much anymore because I think it was a product of its era. There was a phrase to describe children who were young adults or adults who are now in their 30s and 40s. When they were children, a phrase came into our lexicon, Latchkey Kids. And I don't know how many of you remember that phrase. They were the children of the divorce revolution. Divorce spiked very heavily in this country in the 70s and 80s. And a lot of today's young middle-aged adults were a product of those divorces. You also had a situation where economic stressors are such that either typically the divorced single mother is having to work. How the hell do you find a way to work and take care of your kid, and how do you balance all of that? And Americans are pretty resilient about that. One of the trends that we track a lot of is the growing the share of households in this country that are multi-generational family households. More than 2 or more adult generations living under the same roof. A lot of that is for child care. Some of that is the middle-aged person taking care of grandma or grandpa, but a lot of that is grandma or grandpa living with their grown daughters or sons and helping out with their grandchildren. So that is one accommodation. Another accommodation, at least for a period of time, was, all right, my kid's 11, 12, 13 years old. She's old enough to take care of herself, and that horrible time between 3 o'clock and 5 o'clock when I get back from work, here's the key, go home, go to your room, don't mess around with strangers. And I think, I don't want to overstate that, but I think that is part of, if you're raised in that environment, I think one of the messages you get is, anchor institutions of society you can't fully trust. The most important anchor institution in any child's life, of course, is the nuclear family that he or she is born into. So if that family isn't what it was, let me say this about divorce and out-of-marriage births. We're a country that 50 years ago, 5% of all births in this country were to single parents. Today, 40% of all births are to single parents. So you have a lot of children who are not starting out in the traditional nuclear family. Then you have